So, let me ask you a question. What would it take for you to give up absolutely everything? I'm talking your career, your house, your car, all of it, to live for one single year the way you think Jesus would. Well, that is the wild, radical question at the very heart of Jomo Kenyatta Johnson's story. He's a pastor whose life was turned upside down by a crisis of faith, and it sent him on this intense, year-long journey that he documented in his book, 365 Days Like Jesus. And it all started with this one single, shocking statement. When a group of church elders looked Jomo Johnson, a black, seminary-trained pastor, in the eye and said this to him, well, those words didn't just sting, they completely shattered his world. And they set him on a path he could have never, ever imagined. Now, you might have heard of that book, The Year of Living Biblically. But let's be super clear. What Johnson did was the polar opposite. This wasn't some kind of quirky experiment by an agnostic trying to write a bestseller. No, Johnson was a lifelong believer. And for him, this was, in his own words, a desperate attempt to find a person, not just to check off a list of ancient rules. To really understand how he got to such a desperate point, we've got to go back. We need to look at the beginning of his crisis, to the exact moment his life as a minister just completely imploded. See, Jomo Johnson wasn't some newcomer to this. This guy was the real deal. He was a seminary graduate, he'd already planted his first church when he was just 29, and he was a super passionate minister serving in the Presbyterian Church in America. By pretty much any standard, he was living out his calling.
Then, in 2016, what looks like the perfect opportunity came along. A wealthy, almost entirely white church back in his home state of Georgia offered him a really good paying job. The mission? To start a brand new church for the black community. It really seemed like a dream come true.
So Johnson got right to work. He drafted this whole ministry plan that was straight out of the Gospels. I mean, it had a crystal clear focus, reaching out to the most vulnerable people in the community. You know, the poor, the oppressed, people living in homeless shelters and transition centers.
And this is where it all went so wrong. The elders took one look at his plan and rejected it. They actually repeated that awful sentiment we started with. They didn't want those kinds of black people, the ones with major problems. They said they wanted middle-class blacks. The very next night, they fired him. The impact of this was, well, it was devastating. To put it in perspective, think about this stress scale. Getting fired from your job is a 47. A divorce is a 73. Johnson said that losing his calling felt like all of the top 10 most stressful life events hitting him all at once. It was like a spiritual death, a divorce from the church, and the complete end of his life's purpose, all rolled into one terrible night.
But, you know, sometimes out of that kind of profound loss, a new kind of hunger starts to grow. For Johnson, it was this hunger for something real, something more authentic than the comfortable faith he'd known his whole life. It's kind of funny, but Johnson uses an analogy from a Snickers commercial to explain what happened next. We all know that slogan, right? You're not you when you're hungry. It's about that simple physical hunger for a snack. But Johnson was starting to feel a much, much deeper kind of hunger. He was experiencing a spiritual one. He had this realization that for years, he'd been trying to fill this deep spiritual void with things, you know, like success in his ministry, financial security, instead of a genuine relationship with God. In his search for some kind of meaning, he started studying the Black Lives Matter movement. And as he read about their campaigns against violence and systemic racism, he had this lightning bolt thought. Wait a minute, isn't this what the church is supposed to be doing? He started to see the work of social justice as a core part of his faith. And this right here is the key connection he made. His own internal spiritual crisis started to merge with this very public fight for justice. He realized he'd spent years following what he called an American evangelical Jesus, who was all about personal comfort. But now he was desperate to find the historical Jesus of Nazareth, the one who challenged power and always stood with the oppressed. This whole process led him to a 30-day fast, where he just prayed intensely for some direction. And on the 13th day, he says he heard a message that changed everything. I have broken you that you might heal others. That became his new mission. So what would you do if you believed you got a message like that? For Johnson, the answer was terrifying, but it was also crystal clear. He had to forsake everything. And the path he chose was, well, it was absolutely radical. First, he turned down 3 different salaried ministry jobs, the very career he had built his entire life around. Then he sold everything he owned, right down to his Mercedes. And finally, in a truly stunning move, he went back to Georgia, the very place that was the source of all his trauma, and he intentionally became homeless.
He showed up with zero money, and the place he was supposed to stay fell through. So in this moment of just deep, almost unbelievable irony, he spent his first 2 nights homeless, sleeping on a bed of clothes under the protective canopy of a local church. He was literally and figuratively seeking shelter under the cross.
But Johnson's journey wasn't just about his own personal sacrifice and piety. Oh no. It very quickly became about public action and actually confronting systems of power.
He focused his efforts on 2 main targets. First, to county sheriff, because of a series of unexplained deaths happening in the local jail. And second, what he saw as the wider American church's complicity and frankly its silence on issues of racial injustice.
So this led him to organize these silent, non-violent protests. He and a few others would go to church services, including at the very church that had fired him, and during the sermon they would place black tape over their mouths to symbolize the church's silence on injustice, and then they'd quietly walk out.
What Johnson was really doing here was shining on massive spotlight on this core theological tension. He argued that so much of the American church had become obsessed with orthodoxy, which basically means right belief, while completely ignoring orthopraxy, which means right practice or right action. And for him, right practice meant actively fighting for the poor and the oppressed, just like Jesus did.
So after this grueling, unbelievable year of sacrifice, of homelessness, of protest, what was the end result? What did he actually find at the end of this crazy journey? You know, his own words really say it best. He says the whole journey wasn't some stunt to write a book. It was a desperate attempt to truly follow Jesus. And in the end, it evolved into something so much more profound, finding a person. It was about relationship, not just about religiosity.
Johnson's entire journey really leaves us with a pretty provocative question to chew on. Is following a moral or spiritual example about what you believe in your head, or is it about what you're actually willing to do with your hands and your feet?